The fair had been open barely 2 hours when Bruno stopped dead on the midway path, his whole body going rigid. Officer Chris Holden scanned the crowd, hundreds of people, strollers, cotton candy, fried dough, nothing that signaled a threat. But Bruno didn't care. He yanked hard to the left, and Chris knew in that moment that everything was about to change. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where in the world you're listening from, and subscribe so you don't miss stories like this one. Bruno was a Belgian Malinois, 4 years old, sharp as a blade, and Chris had worked with him long enough to know that pull to the left meant something real. Chris had been assigned to the Cloverfield County Fair for a routine crowd patrol, a quiet Sunday shift he'd welcomed after a rough week. His paperwork had piled up. His sergeant had barked at him twice, and he'd slept less than 4 hours a night for the last stretch. He needed a slow day, a warm sun, and the smell of caramel apples in the air. He needed calm. Bruno, apparently, had other plans. The dog wove through clusters of families and teenagers, ears forward, tail flat. Chris let him lead. In 3 years of working together, Bruno had never pulled like this without a reason. Not once had it been a false alarm. Chris trusted him the way you trust your own hand. They passed the funnel cake stand and the row of carnival games, past a woman holding a stuffed bear the size of her toddler, past a man in a plaid shirt taking a picture of his kids on a pony. Bruno kept moving, low and steady, straight toward the rows of food stands along the east fence. Then he stopped, planted himself in front of a kettle corn stand, and lifted his head. Chris followed his gaze. A woman was standing with her back to them, studying a laminated map of the fairgrounds. She wore a faded denim jacket and a grey t-shirt, jeans and sneakers that had seen too many miles. Her hair was short and dark, cut in a way that suggested she'd done it herself in a bathroom mirror. There was nothing threatening about her, nothing suspicious, just a woman trying to figure out where the restrooms were. Bruno sat. He didn't bark, he didn't lunge. He simply sat at Chris's heel and looked at her with those calm, steady brown eyes, his tail sweeping the dusty ground in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Chris felt his throat tighten. He knew that tail sweep. He'd seen it once when Bruno had found a lost child under the bleachers at a high school football game. He'd seen it when Bruno had greeted his previous trainer at a retirement dinner. It wasn't the alert of a working dog. It was the recognition of something loved. Chris felt a cold weight settle in his stomach before he even understood why. The woman turned. For a moment, the whole fair seemed to go quiet. The calliope music from the merry-go-round, the shouts of the barkers, the shrieks from the zipper, all of it fell away, and Chris was looking at a face he hadn't seen in 7 years. Megan, his sister. She was 32 now. 7 years older than the last photo their mother kept on the kitchen wall, and the years had left marks. There was a small scar above her left brow he didn't recognize. Her cheekbones were sharper. Her eyes were the same, though, that grey-green color their grandmother used to call storm water, and right now they were wide and unblinking, fixed on Bruno like she was seeing a ghost. Then her eyes moved up to Chris. Her hand went flat against her sternum, and Chris knew that gesture too. She'd done it as a kid, whenever their mother had raised her voice, whenever a door had slammed unexpectedly. A reflex, bracing for impact. Chris. Her voice came out smaller than he remembered and softer, like she'd been saving it for something and was afraid it wouldn't be enough. He didn't speak right away. Couldn't. 7 years of silence had built a wall between them, and he could feel every brick of it, the missed birthdays, the unanswered calls, the Christmas cards that came back stamped, "Return to sender." Their mother standing at the kitchen window with her hand on the glass, waiting for a car that never came. But Bruno was already leaning forward, straining slightly against the leash, and Megan took one step, then another, and then she was on her knees in the dust with her arms around the dog's neck and her face pressed into his fur, the way she used to when Bruno was barely past puppyhood, when she'd spend whole summer afternoons with him on the back porch on Oak Street. Chris crouched beside her. He didn't have words yet, so he didn't try to find any. She pulled back after a long moment, her eyes red, and looked at him. "I was going to call you," she said. "I swear I was." He tried to answer and his throat closed. He nodded instead. Bruno, sensing something bigger than commands, leaned his weight gently against Megan's knee and stayed there. "How long?" Chris finally managed. Megan swallowed. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. She'd been back in town for 3 weeks and hadn't come home. "I've been renting a room over on 3rd Street, she said. 2 miles from Mom's house. 2 miles. I keep driving past. I keep sitting in the car at the end of the block and losing my nerve. Every day I tell myself, today, and every night I sit in that room with the light off." She wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "I came to the fair because it was somewhere I could be near home without being inside it." Chris looked at Bruno. Bruno looked back at him with the calm, patient expression of a dog who had just handed him a problem far bigger than anything on his shift schedule. He reached for his phone. His hand was shaking, which annoyed him. Cops weren't supposed to have shaking hands. He'd faced down a man with a knife in a parking lot last November without so much as a tremor. But dialing his mother's number felt harder than any of it. She picked up on the second ring. "Chris, you okay?" "Mom!" His voice cracked. He hadn't meant it to. "Mom, I need you to come to the fair, right now. The Cloverfield County Fair, the East Gate." There was a silence on the other end. Not a confused silence, not a curious one. A held-breath silence, like a woman who had been waiting for a phone call for 7 years and had just heard the receiver click. "I'm getting my keys," Linda Holden said. She didn't ask why. She didn't ask what was wrong. Something in his voice had told her everything she needed to know. Chris ended the call and looked at his sister. She was still on her knees in the dust, still holding on to Bruno like the dog was the only anchor keeping her from being blown away. "Mum's coming," he said. Megan nodded, but her face crumpled, and she pressed both hands over her mouth like she was trying to hold the sound inside her body. Bruno watched her without moving. And somewhere, in a small rented room on 3rd Street 2 miles away, in a locked drawer of a battered nightstand, a folded blue envelope waited for what came next. Neither of them knew about it yet. But by the end of the week, that envelope was going to change everything for the Holden family, and Chris would look back on this exact moment on the Midway Path, this warm July afternoon smelling of sugar and dust, as the moment his whole idea of who he was had begun to come apart. He helped his sister to her feet. Her knees were shaking. He kept his hand under her elbow. "Come sit," he said. "There's a bench by the East Gate. We'll wait there." They walked slowly. Bruno kept his head under Megan's hand the whole way. Chris felt strangers looking at them and did not look back. Linda Holden arrived at the East Gate of the fair 13 minutes after the phone call ended, and Chris knew, without her saying anything, that she had run every red light between her front door and the parking lot. Her hair was pushed behind her ears in the hurried way she pushed it when she was scared, and she was wearing her house slippers. She saw Megan before Megan saw her. For one long moment, Linda stopped, one hand pressed to the metal railing of the ticket booth, and just looked. Her chest rose and fell like she was climbing a hill. Chris stood back and let her. He knew this moment did not belong to him. Then Megan turned. There is a sound a mother makes when she sees the child she thought was lost for good, and it isn't crying exactly, and it isn't laughter. It is something older than either of those, something that comes up from the ground beneath her feet and out through her chest all at once. Linda made that sound. She crossed the space between them in 5 long strides, and she had her arms around her daughter before Megan could get a full breath in. They didn't speak for a while. There was nothing to say that would fit into words yet. Chris took Bruno by the collar and stepped a few feet back, giving them the small circle of privacy that a public fair could offer, which wasn't much. A little girl at the kettle corn stand tugged her mother's sleeve and pointed at them. Her mother pulled her hand down and shook her head and said something quiet. The little girl looked away. Bruno sat at Chris's heel, his ears forward, his eyes on Megan and Linda both. He did not whine. He did not fidget. He simply watched, like an old friend at the back of a chapel. After a long time, Linda pulled back, cupped her daughter's face in both her hands, and studied her the way a woman studies a photograph she had believed was burned. "You're too thin," she said. Megan laughed. It came out wet. "You always say that." "You are, though." Linda's thumb traced the scar above Megan's brow. "This is new. It's nothing. Fell off a bike 2 summers ago." "You have a bike?" "I had one." "Where?" Megan hesitated. Chris caught the hesitation and filed it away without meaning to. Cop's habit. He would think about that hesitation many times over the coming days, would return to it in the middle of the night, the way you return to a splinter you felt but haven't been able to see, and each time he thought about it, the shape of it would sharpen. "Later, Mom, I promise. Later." Linda nodded. She wiped her own eyes with the heel of her hand and turned to Chris, and Chris was struck suddenly by how much smaller his mother had become in the last few years. She had always been a tall woman, straight-backed, sturdy. Now the width of her shoulders looked collapsed. Now her collarbone stood out under the neck of her cardigan. "He was the one who found her," Chris said, nodding to Bruno. Linda looked down at the Malinois. She crouched, slower than she used to, and put her hand on Bruno's broad head. Bruno leaned into it. "You always were the smart one," she told the dog. They found the wooden bench near the east gate and sat on it, all 3 of them, with Bruno stretched across their feet like a warm rug. The fair kept moving around them. Kids ran past screaming. A man in a striped shirt called out the price of ring toss games. A country song played from a speaker somewhere, but on the bench, under a cottonwood tree that was old before any of them were born, something was becoming still. Linda held her daughter's hand and did not let go. "You come home tonight," she said. It was not a question. "Mom, tonight." Megan looked at Chris. Chris looked at his mother. Then he looked back at his sister and nodded once. "Tonight," he said. And Megan, who had spent 7 years running and 3 weeks parked at the end of a block she couldn't walk down, finally said, "Okay." Bruno had not always been a police dog. He had come into the Holden family as a puppy. The winter Megan was 15 and Chris was 12. It was a bad winter, the kind of cold that made the pipes rattle in the basement, and Megan had been walking home from school by the back way, cutting through the alley behind the old brewery, when she'd heard something whimper in a cardboard box beside a dumpster. She had brought him home in her coat. Their father, John Holden, had died 3 years earlier, a heart attack while he was mowing the lawn on a Saturday morning. No warning, no chance. He had been 41. Linda had been left with 2 kids, a mortgage, and a job at the school district's front office that didn't quite stretch. Money had been tight. A puppy had not been on the list. But when Megan had walked through the front door, with the shivering black and tan bundle in her jacket, and her eyes wet from the cold and something else, Linda had looked at her daughter for a long moment and had said, "Get him some milk." Megan had named him Bruno, after a school teacher she'd loved, a big gentle man who had died the summer before. She had raised him on the back porch of the house on Oak Street, feeding him from a doll's baby bottle at first, then teaching him to sit, to stay, to come. She had read library books about Belgian Malinois because it had turned out that was what he was, this abandoned dog, a working breed with more energy than a whole soccer team. She had trained him better than anyone had a right to expect from a 15-year-old girl. By the time Bruno was 2, he could open doors, retrieve items by name, and lie perfectly still under a table full of guests without so much as a twitching ear. Chris had grown up in Bruno's shadow. He had loved the dog, but the dog had been Megan's, the way certain animals choose one person and belong to them absolutely. Then Megan had turned 22, and the fight had come, and she had left. And one Tuesday morning Chris had walked into the kitchen and found Bruno lying by the front door with his chin on his paws, waiting for the door to open, waiting for a person who was not coming back. Chris had knelt beside him. "Come on, buddy," he'd said. "Come on. Come on." Bruno had not moved for 2 days. 6 months later, when Chris was 20 and starting at the police academy, he had asked the trainer whether a family dog could be worked up to K9 standard. The trainer had told him the odds were bad. Most patrol dogs came from lines bred for the work. But when the trainer had seen Bruno, had watched him move, had watched the intelligence sitting behind his eyes, the trainer had said, "Let's see." Bruno had passed every stage. He had graduated with Chris on a hot August morning 3 years later, and Chris's mother had come to the ceremony and cried. And Bruno, wearing his new badge on his collar, had walked to the edge of the parade ground and looked, for one long moment, at the empty seat next to Linda where his other person had never sat. Then he had come back to Chris's side. He had chosen a new person because that was what he had to do. But he had never entirely forgotten, not the scent, not the sound of her laugh, not the shape of her walking away. And when he had smelled her, 4 years later, in a crowd of 2,000 strangers at the Cloverfield County Fair, he had known instantly, absolutely, that his first person was back. That evening in the house on Oak Street, Megan sat at the kitchen table she had eaten 1,000 breakfasts at, and Linda made grilled cheese sandwiches because it was the only thing she could think to cook. Nobody was hungry. They ate anyway. Chris watched his sister the whole time and tried to figure out what was wrong. Not wrong exactly. Something in her was careful. She looked at her phone every 12 minutes with the kind of quick check that people do when they're waiting for a call they don't want anyone else to see. She kept her purse, a soft green canvas thing, worn at the corners, beside her on the chair, not on the floor. When Linda offered to take it, Megan said, "That's okay, I've got it." Bruno lay under the table with his chin on Megan's foot. Chris made himself notice small things. He'd been a cop for 9 years. He was good at small things. He noticed that Megan flinched very slightly when a car door slammed outside. He noticed that when Linda mentioned the neighborhood, Megan asked whether the Petersons still lived across the street, but she did not ask about Frank. She did not ask about the man who had been living in her mother's house for 6 years. She did not ask his name. Around 8, Megan excused herself and stepped out into the backyard. Chris watched her through the kitchen window. She stood by the porch railing, phone against her ear, one hand pressed flat to her forehead. He couldn't hear the words. He could see the way her shoulders lifted and dropped as she talked, the way her free hand kept moving, drawing shapes in the air like she was explaining something complicated. When she came back inside, her eyes were shining. "Everything okay?" Linda asked. "Yeah." Megan sat down. "Yeah, everything's fine." Chris caught his mother's eye across the table. Linda looked away first. Later, when Linda had gone up to bed and the house was quiet except for the ticking of the kitchen clock, Chris sat with his sister on the back porch, the way they used to when they were teenagers. Bruno lay between them with his tail thumping slowly against the wood every time either of them moved. "So," Chris said. Megan looked at him. "So, you want to tell me what's really going on?" She was quiet for a long time. The crickets sang. A car passed somewhere on the next street. A porch light came on 2 houses down, and then, after a minute, went out again. "I have a daughter," she said. Chris didn't move. "Her name's Emma. She's 6. She's back in the room I'm renting. There's a woman there, someone I trust, watching her tonight. I didn't want to bring her here until I needed to see how it was going to go, with you, with Mom." 6, Chris said. 6. He did the math. 6 years old meant she'd been born a year after Megan had left. He wanted to ask 100 questions. He asked one. Her father, Megan swallowed. He died 3 years ago. Car accident on the interstate up near Toledo. He was a good man, Chris. His name was Daniel. He was a mechanic. He wasn't in the picture very long, but for the time he was the best thing that ever happened to me. I'm sorry. Yeah, me too. She reached down and put her hand on Bruno's back. Bruno's tail thumped harder. Can I meet her? Chris asked. Megan looked at him. She was crying again, but silently, and she was smiling at the same time. Yeah, she said. You can meet her. Tomorrow. First thing. He nodded. Meg. Yeah. I know there's more. She looked at him. She did not deny it. She did not confirm it. She just looked. When you're ready, Chris said. Soon, Chris, soon. She stayed on the porch after he went in. He heard her voice, low, talking to the dog, for a long time before the back door finally opened and closed, and her footsteps went up the stairs. He met Emma the next morning. She was small for 6, with her mother's stormwater eyes and a mop of dark hair that she kept trying to pin back with a purple butterfly clip that didn't quite hold. She was wearing a t-shirt with a horse on it and jeans with a hole in one knee. She was holding a stuffed rabbit that had been washed so many times its ears were flat. When Megan opened the door of the rented room and stepped back, Emma looked out at Chris, and Chris looked back at her, and Bruno, standing at Chris's side, made a small sound in the back of his throat that was neither a whine nor a growl. It was something else. It was the sound of recognition, not of the child whom he had never met, but of the family she was part of. Emma looked at the dog first. She looked at Chris second. Are you the uncle? She asked. Yeah, Chris said. I'm the uncle. Mum said you have a dog. This is Bruno. Emma looked at Bruno. Bruno looked at Emma. Then Emma held out her hand, palm down, the way somebody had taught her to do, and Bruno sniffed her fingers. And then he stepped closer and pressed his big head against her side, and Emma laughed, a bright, surprised laugh, like a bell. Megan pressed her hand over her mouth. That afternoon they drove to the house on Oak Street. Emma sat in the back seat, holding her stuffed rabbit with both hands. When Linda opened the front door and saw the little girl standing on the porch, she made that sound again, the mother sound, and then she was on her knees on the welcome mat, and Emma, who had been briefed carefully by Megan on the way over, was in her arms. You look like my grandmother in the picture, Emma said, muffled into Linda's cardigan. I am your grandmother, sweetheart. I know, Mom said. I meant you look like her from before. Linda laughed and cried at the same time. Chris stood back and let them have it. Bruno stood beside him, tail sweeping the porch boards. He watched the reunion with the still, satisfied attention of a dog who was pleased with his day's work. Chris put his hand on the dog's head. You did this, he said quietly. Bruno did not answer, but he did lean against Chris's leg, and that was answer enough. For 3 days, everything was good. Emma slept in Megan's old room, in the same bed Megan had slept in as a kid, under the same pale blue quilt Linda had made when Megan was 7. Bruno curled up beside her every night, with his head on her feet. Emma had never had a dog before. She kept whispering to him about her day, and Bruno kept responding by wagging his tail against the mattress and licking her cheek exactly once before she fell asleep. Linda cooked. She cooked like she was trying to make up for 7 years of missed meals in one weekend. There was pot roast on Sunday, meatloaf on Monday, chicken and dumplings on Tuesday. There were cookies cooling on the kitchen counter at all hours. Megan gained back a little of the weight she was missing in her face. Chris slept better than he had in months. Emma discovered the treehouse in the maple in the backyard, the one John Holden had built with his own hands the summer before he died, the one Megan had claimed as her own at 14 and had never really given up. The rope ladder was rotten now. Chris fixed it that Sunday afternoon, drilling in fresh planks and knotting new hemp rope, while Bruno watched from the shade below. Emma climbed up and refused to come down for lunch. So Megan sent up a sandwich in a plastic bag on a string, and Emma announced from her lookout post that this was the best day of her whole life. Linda watched from the kitchen window and cried. And then Frank came home. Frank Doyle was Linda's second husband, or almost husband. Technically, they had never remarried after John's death, but Frank had moved into the house on Oak Street 6 years ago and had been there ever since. He was 58, tall and lean, with silver hair he kept short and neat, and a smile that always reached his eyes. He was a carpenter, or had been, until his knees had gone. He had done a great deal of the work on the addition off the back of the house himself. He was, by every visible measure, a good man. He had been in Tennessee for 2 weeks, visiting his brother when Megan had come home. He drove into the driveway on Wednesday evening in his blue pickup truck, and Chris happened to be there when he came through the front door. Frank saw Emma first. There was a moment, small, but Chris caught it, when Frank's expression stopped moving. It was not a flinch. It was the opposite of a flinch. It was the sudden, deliberate stillness of a face that had been surprised and was choosing what to do with the surprise. Then Frank smiled. "Well, hello there. Who is this?" Linda came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on a dish towel. Frank, this is Emma. This is Megan's girl." Frank looked from Emma to Linda to the doorway of the living room, where Megan had appeared, and was standing very still. "Megan," he said, warm, almost too warm. "My goodness. Lynn, you didn't tell me. I didn't know how to." He crossed the room in 3 steps and pulled Megan into a hug. Chris watched his sister's back. Her arms went around Frank's shoulders, but they went slow, like her body was doing something her mind didn't want it to do. "It's so good to have you home," Frank said. "It's so good." Megan didn't answer. Bruno, who had been lying by the fireplace, stood up. He did not bark. He did not growl. He simply stood and looked at Frank with his ears half back and his tail low. His whole weight was slightly forward on the balls of his feet. It was a posture Chris had seen him take exactly twice in 3 years. Once in an alley behind a convenience store where a man had a knife in his back pocket, and once at a domestic call where an old woman had opened the door with fear in her eyes, and a man had been standing behind her. Chris noticed. He didn't say anything, but he noticed. Emma, who had been playing quietly on the rug with a coloring book, looked up at Frank, then at her mother. Megan reached down and, without a word, held out her hand. Emma took it and stood up and walked over and stayed close to her mother's leg. Bruno crossed the room and lay down between Emma and Frank. Frank looked at the dog for a moment, then he laughed, a soft, easy laugh, and said, "I don't think this fella likes me much. He didn't like me last year either, remember, Lynn?" "He's a working dog," Linda said too quickly. "He's serious." Sure. Frank went to shower and change from the drive. When his footsteps faded up the stairs, Megan let go of Emma's hand and sat down hard on the couch. Chris sat down beside her. She did not speak. Neither did he. That night, Frank went to bed early. He said he was tired from the drive. He kissed Linda on the temple and told her he was glad she was happy, and he padded up the stairs in his socks, and the bedroom door closed at the top of the landing. Chris found Megan in the kitchen at the sink, washing a coffee mug she'd already washed once. "Meg," she didn't turn. "Meg." She set the mug down slowly. Her shoulders were shaking. "Meg, what is it?" "I can't do this here, Chris." Her voice was low. "Not in the house, not tonight, tomorrow. Can we go somewhere tomorrow? Just us, and I'll tell you everything. But not here." He watched the back of her neck for a moment. Then he said, "Okay." She turned. Her eyes were red. "Promise you'll listen." "I always listen." "No." She shook her head. "No, Chris. Really listen. Because what I'm going to say, you're not going to want to hear it, and every part of you is going to try to talk yourself out of it. And I need you not to." He felt something cold slide down his spine. He didn't know why. Or he did know why. He had known why since the moment Bruno had stopped in the middle of the living room and stood between his sister's child and the man who had been calling this house home for 6 years. Some part of him had known why, since Megan had said the word soon on the back porch 2 nights before. "Okay," he said. "I promise." Bruno, who had been standing quietly in the doorway watching them, walked over and pressed his side against Megan's leg. Megan reached down and put her hand on his head. "Good boy," she whispered. "You always were the good one." They met at a diner on the west side of town the next morning at 10. Chris ordered coffee. Megan ordered nothing. She had barely slept. There were fresh, dark half-moons under her eyes, and her hands, wrapped around a paper napkin, would not stop moving. Bruno lay under the table. The diner was called Ruthie's, and it had been there since Chris was in high school. The vinyl of the booth was cracked, and the coffee was terrible in the way old diner coffee is always terrible, and Chris did not touch his cup. "Start wherever you want," he said. Megan wrapped both hands around the paper napkin and looked at the table. "You remember the fight?" she said. "Some of it, not everything. You were 15. It was the fall after Mom married, after Frank moved in. Not a wedding. I know they didn't have a wedding. When he moved his stuff in. You remember?" "Yeah. I was 22. I was living at home still, saving up for my own place. I was working at that veterinary clinic on 14th, the one that's a laundromat now. I remember. I came home one night from work. It was a Wednesday, I think, because I had a night class on Wednesdays, and Frank was in the living room on the phone. He didn't hear me come in. I stopped in the hallway because his voice was different. It wasn't his voice, it was quieter, kind of softer." She looked up at Chris. Chris waited. He was talking to a woman, I could tell. And he was saying, "I love you too, honey. I'll be there this weekend." And I stood in that hallway for maybe 10 seconds, and then he heard the floor creak and he turned around, and his face did the thing, that thing his face did last night when he saw Emma, that stop and decide thing. And then he smiled at me and he said, "Meg, sweetheart, didn't hear you come in." Chris set his coffee cup down. "I told myself 100 things over the next few days," Megan said. "Maybe I misheard. Maybe it was his sister. Maybe it was a client. He called female clients honey sometimes, you remember. So I let it go. I didn't say anything. And then, 2 months later, I was working late, and I decided to swing by the hardware store on Route 6 on my way home. And there was a blue pickup truck in the parking lot with a big scratch on the tailgate. And I recognized it, and Frank came out of the store with a woman on his arm and a little boy holding her hand." Chris didn't move. "They kissed in the parking lot, Chris, right there in front of the store. He kissed her the way a husband kisses a wife, and the little boy called him Daddy." Chris felt the floor of the diner tilt very slowly. "I sat in my car, and I watched them get into the truck and drive away. I wrote down the license plate. I drove home. I went inside. Frank wasn't there yet. I sat on the couch with Mom, and we watched a movie, and I couldn't hear a word of it. I couldn't decide what to do, because if I was right, it was going to blow up Mom's whole life. She had just started to be happy again. It was the first time since Dad died that she'd been really happy. And I couldn't. I couldn't be the one to take that from her, but I couldn't not be either. So you waited." "I waited, I did. I did the research. I drove out to Springfield, that was the town on the license plate, and I sat in a coffee shop across from a school playground for 2 days, until I saw them come out, the woman and the boy. I followed them home. It was a house, a nice little house on a nice little street. There was a mailbox with the name Doyle on it. She was his wife, Chris, legally married. They'd been married before he ever met Mom." Chris put his hands flat on the table because he needed them not to shake. "How do you know that?" "I paid a paralegal in Columbus $180 to pull the marriage record. Frank Doyle married a woman named Karen Bishop in 1991. They never divorced. The certificate is filed in Clark County. It's public record. I have the copy in a folder in my rented room right now." Chris was quiet for a long time. "I confronted him," Megan said. "That's the fight. That's what nobody in this family understands. I didn't storm out because Mom and I couldn't agree about my life choices. I sat him down when Mom was at the grocery store, and I told him what I knew. And he was so calm, Chris. He didn't get angry. He didn't beg. He looked at me across the kitchen table and he said, 'You have no idea what you're talking about. And if you say a word of this to your mother, I will make sure she never trusts you again.' And then he did. Mom came home 2 hours later and Frank had already told her that I'd been struggling, that I'd been drinking, that I'd said crazy things about him. And Mom didn't want to believe him, but she also didn't want to believe me. And she was scared, Chris. She was scared of losing him, and I could see it in her face. I could see her choosing." Megan wiped her nose with the napkin. "I packed a bag that night. I left the folder with the paralegal's report in a lockbox at a friend's apartment. And I got in my car and I drove." Chris closed his eyes. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. "Meg, why didn't you tell me?" "You were 15, Chris. You loved him. Everybody loved him. He was the reason Mom laughed at the dinner table again. I couldn't put that on you." "You could have." "Maybe. Yeah, maybe. I've had 7 years to think about that decision, and some days I think I did the wrong thing, and some days I think I did the only thing I could do. But it doesn't matter anymore, because Karen Bishop died last year, Chris. I saw the obituary online, and 2 months ago, Frank called an old friend of hers, a woman named Doreen, and asked her to help him sort through some paperwork. And Doreen called me." "Called you? How?" "I kept in touch, Chris. I've been in touch with people in Springfield for 7 years. I've been waiting." Chris was staring at her. "There's more," she said. "More. He's been transferring assets. The house on Oak Street, Mom's savings. He's putting things in his name, quietly, one at a time. He has a lawyer in Columbus who's helping him. And in about 3 weeks, he's leaving. He's going to sell everything, take the money and disappear. There's a boy, Chris, Frank's other son. His name is Kyle. He's 24 now. Kyle knows about Mom. Kyle wants a share of what's coming. Frank has been telling him it's almost time. Doreen has been at Kyle's mother's house helping to pack. She sent me an email 2 weeks ago. That's why I came home." Chris pushed his coffee cup away. "Meg, I know. Meg, I have the emails. I have the paralegal's report. I have photos from 2019 of him and Karen at a restaurant in Springfield. I have Doreen's phone number. She'll talk to you. She wants to talk to you." He stared at her. She was not crying anymore. She was watching him carefully, waiting to see what he would do. Under the table, Bruno shifted and pressed his warm side against Chris's foot. Chris looked down at the dog. Then he looked at his sister. "Okay," he said. "Okay, show me." He drove her back to the rented room on 3rd Street. He sat on the edge of a couch that had been left there by the last tenant, and he opened a slim manila folder, worn at the corners, held together with a rubber band. Megan had labeled the sections in pencil, in the neat, small handwriting Chris remembered from high school algebra homework. Marriage certificate, tax records, photographs, witnesses, timeline. He read every page. He looked at every photograph. There was one photo, a wide shot taken through the front window of a restaurant, cheap paper, glossy, that showed Frank sitting across a small table from a thin, tired-looking woman with graying blonde hair. He was reaching across the table and holding her hand. She was looking at him the way Chris had seen his own mother look at Frank 100 times, with the calm, tender attention of a woman who believes she is loved. Chris looked at that photograph for a long time. "Where was this taken?" he asked. "A place called The Landing. It's off the highway in Springfield. Doreen took it. She followed him one night after she started to suspect something. When? October 2019. Chris had spent Thanksgiving of 2019 at the kitchen table on Oak Street. Frank had carved the turkey. Frank had told a long story about a job he'd done up in Zanesville, a barn conversion that had turned into a nightmare. Everybody had laughed. Chris had drunk 2 beers and had gone to bed feeling grateful for the family he had. He looked at the photo again. He called Doreen from Megan's living room, put the phone on speaker, and asked her 3 careful, cop-trained questions. Doreen answered all of them without hesitation. Her voice was tired and steady and sad. She told him she had been Karen's best friend for 30 years. She told him she had never known that Frank had another family. She told him Karen had died believing her husband loved her. She told him Frank had never called Karen his wife in front of certain neighbors, but had introduced her as his wife to others, and that Karen had never questioned it, never questioned him about anything, because that was the kind of woman Karen was. She told him she was ready to testify if it came to that. Chris ended the call, sat on Megan's couch, and did not move for a long time. Bruno lay across his feet. He's been in Mom's house for 6 years, Chris said. I've had Thanksgiving with him. He gave me a fishing rod for my 30th birthday. He drove me to physical therapy after I tore my rotator cuff. He came to my police academy graduation and clapped louder than anybody else. I know. Every time I looked at him, I thought, good guy, solid guy, good for Mom. I know, Chris, I know. How did I not see it? You weren't looking. Why would you look? Nobody looks at the person their mother loves and asks, is this a con man? He put his hands over his face. What do we do? Megan sat down beside him. Bruno shifted to make room. We go to Mom, she said. We tell her. Together. We give her the folder. We give her Doreen's number. We let her decide what she wants to do. It's her life. It's her house. It's her marriage. She has to be the one who decides. He said he was leaving in 3 weeks. He said that to Kyle, and Doreen thinks he's moved it up. She thinks he's leaving this weekend. Chris looked at the calendar on Megan's kitchen wall. It was Thursday. 3 days. He sat with the numbers for a while. Then, because he was a cop, and because a piece of him was not yet ready to believe the whole thing, because there is a difference between reading the folder and having every cell in your body accept what the folder says, he drove down to the courthouse in Columbus that afternoon on his lunch break and pulled the marriage certificate for himself. He watched the clerk print it. He held it in his hand. He read the names. Frank Allen Doyle, Karen Elizabeth Bishop, married the 12th of June, 1991, at Second Baptist Church in Springfield, Ohio. No divorce filing, not in Clark County, not in Franklin County, not in any Ohio county at all. He drove back to Megan's. He sat on her couch again. Okay, he said. Okay, let's tell Mom. They told Linda that night. They waited until Frank was in the shower. Chris sat with his mother at the kitchen table. Megan sat across from her. Bruno lay across the doorway to the hall, blocking it in a way that a person going upstairs might not notice, but that would prevent someone from coming down quietly to eavesdrop. Chris did most of the talking because he thought his mother might hear him better than her. Linda listened. She did not interrupt. She did not cry. She did not gasp. She sat with her hands folded on the table, and she listened. And when Chris was finished, she opened the folder Megan had put in front of her, and she began, slowly, page by page, to read. She read the marriage certificate first. Then she looked at the photographs. Then she read Doreen's typed statement. Then she closed the folder and put both her hands on top of it, palms flat, like she was holding it shut against something that might try to get out. How long have you known? She asked her daughter. 7 years. You left because of this? Yes. Linda closed her eyes. Upstairs, the shower shut off. They all 3 heard it. Bruno's ears rotated back. He'll be down in 10 minutes, Linda said. Mom, Chris, listen to me, listen to your mother. Linda opened her eyes, and Chris saw for the first time in his life a kind of steel in them he had never known was there. His mother had always been the soft one, the one who cried at movies, the one who kept the birthday cards and pressed the leaves. But there had been a woman under all of that, who had raised 2 kids alone after her husband died in the front yard, and that woman was awake now, and looking at him. You are a police officer. Are we going to be able to prove any of this in a court of law? I think so, if we act fast. Then here is what we are going to do, right now, tonight. Frank is going to come downstairs, and I am going to smile at him, and I am going to make him a cup of coffee, and I am going to tell him you 2 have gone home, and you are going to leave, and you are going to come back tomorrow morning at 9, when he is at the pharmacy, and we are going to go to the bank, and to the lawyer, and to the sheriff, and we are going to do this the right way, and the fast way. Do you understand me? Chris stared at her. Do you understand me, Christopher? Yes, ma'am. Megan! Linda reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. I am so sorry. I am so sorry. I did not know. I thought so many wrong things. There is going to be time later for us to sit with all of that. Right now, we do not have time. Do you forgive me for right now, so that we can move? Yes, Mom. Good girl, now go. Take Emma. Chris, take Bruno. 9 in the morning. Chris stood up. His knees felt strange. He bent down and touched his mother's shoulder. She was trembling under his hand, just slightly, but her face was set. Mom. Go, Chris. They went. They did not know it at the time, but they had already lost. When they had been sitting at the kitchen table reading Doreen's statement together, Frank had come out of the shower earlier than expected. He had padded across the upstairs hall in bare feet, and he had heard voices from the kitchen, and he had stopped at the top of the stairs. He had heard Chris say the word bigamy. He had heard Megan say Karen's name. He had heard the folder open. And he had stood at the top of the stairs for a long time, dripping onto the runner, listening to a conversation he had known for 7 years was coming. Then he had turned around, gone back into the bedroom, and started to pack. At 9 the next morning, Chris pulled into the driveway on Oak Street with Bruno in the back seat and Megan in the passenger seat. Frank's blue pickup was gone. Chris felt his stomach drop. He said pharmacy, Megan started. They ran into the house. Linda was at the kitchen table with her face in her hands. The folder was open in front of her, and beside it was a note, folded once, written in Frank's tight, familiar handwriting. Chris read it over her shoulder. Lynn, it said. I'm sorry, I heard more than you thought I did last night. I've been meaning to make some decisions for a while, and I think it's time. Don't try to find me. I'm not worth it. Take care. F. Below that, in smaller writing, added like an afterthought, the truck's yours. The house is yours. I'm sorry. He heard us, Linda said. How? He came down. He said he wanted a glass of water. I heard the stairs. I said something loud so you'd know, but you didn't hear me, or you thought it was normal. He must have stood at the corner and listened for I don't know how long. Chris felt Bruno leaning against his leg. He looked at the note. He looked at his sister. He looked at his mother. How much did he take? He asked. Linda got up slowly and went to the china cabinet in the dining room. She reached behind the third drawer down and pulled out a small envelope. She opened it. It was empty. About $16,000 in cash, she said. I kept it in there for emergencies. It was your father's insurance money. What was left of it? Megan sat down on the couch, hard. He'll go to Kyle, she said. He'll go to the house in Springfield. He'll grab whatever he can from there and be gone by tonight. There's an airport in Dayton. He could be out of the state by morning. Chris pulled out his phone. He dialed dispatch. Then he stopped. What? Megan said. I can't do this through dispatch, not yet. If I file this as a police matter without evidence in hand, they'll process it slow, and he'll be over the state line by the time anybody moves. I need to do this myself first. I need to catch him at Springfield, get him held long enough for the paperwork to catch up. I can call it in from the road, but I need to be there when he's stopped. Chris, you can't just... I'm not going to hurt him, Meg. I just need to slow him down. He looked at Bruno. And I've got the best partner in the world for slowing people down. Bruno's tail thumped once against the couch. He'll deny everything, Linda said quietly. You know he will. He's very good at that. He won't deny it with $16,000 in his glove compartment and a suitcase full of clothes in his back seat and a lawyer's business card in his shirt pocket, which he'll have all of because he's Frank. Chris was already at the door. Wait, Megan said. Wait, I'm coming with you. Meg, I'm not letting you do this alone. I've been alone with this for 7 years. I'm not being alone with it for 1 more hour. He looked at her. Then he nodded. Fine, but you stay in the car, and if things go sideways, you drive back to Columbus and you call the sheriff's office directly. Ask for Sergeant Nolan. He owes me a favor. Got it. Linda stood at the front door as they got into the truck. Bring him back here, she called after them. Alive and awake. I want to be the one to talk to him first. Chris put the truck in reverse. Yes, ma'am. Springfield was 90 minutes north. Bruno rode in the back seat with his nose pressed to the crack of the window, drinking in the moving air. Megan sat in the passenger seat with her hands folded in her lap, quiet. Chris drove faster than he should have and didn't say so. The interstate was empty in that morning after rush hour way that made the road feel like it belonged just to them. Chris passed a semi, then another, then settled into the left lane at 90 and stayed there. Megan didn't tell him to slow down. You know what I keep thinking? She said after 20 miles of silence. What? I keep thinking about the first summer he was in the house. You remember? He built that swing on the back porch. He hung it from that big beam. Took him a whole Saturday. And when he was done, he sat down on it with Mom, and they swung for an hour, and I thought, okay, this might be all right. He was good at that, Chris said. He was good at looking like the guy who was building the swing. That's what I keep thinking. It isn't like he was pretending the whole time. Some of it was real. That's what I can't get past. Some of it had to be real. You can't fake 6 years of Sunday dinners. Chris was quiet for a long moment. I don't know, he said finally. I don't know how much of any of it was real. Maybe some, maybe none. Maybe he loved her some of the days and just performed the other days and couldn't tell the difference anymore himself. Megan looked out the window. That's a sad way to be a person. Yeah. They had been on the road for 40 minutes when Megan's phone rang. She looked at the screen. Her face went white. It's Doreen. Answer it. She put it on speaker. Meg? Doreen's voice was tight. Frank's here. He's at the house. He came in the back door. He's loading stuff into the truck. Kyle is with him. I'm across the street in my car. What do you want me to do? Chris pressed the accelerator harder. Doreen, this is Chris Holden, Meg's brother. I'm about 45 minutes out. Do not confront him. Do not call the local police yet. This is complicated, and I don't want it to fall apart on jurisdiction. Just watch. If he leaves before I get there, I need you to try to see which direction he goes and stay on the line with Meg. He's in the house right now. I can see through the front window. He's yelling at Kyle. About what? I can't hear. But Kyle is throwing something. There's a lamp on the floor. Kyle's mad, Meg. Megan looked at Chris. Kyle didn't know he was running out on him, Chris said. He was supposed to get a share. Frank told him he was included, but when Frank ran this morning, he ran alone. So Kyle is the reason Frank is not going to make it out of that house before we get there. He was right. Doreen kept them on the line for the next 35 minutes. She narrated in a low, steady whisper. Frank had come out with a suitcase. Kyle had followed him yelling. Kyle had thrown the suitcase into the yard. Frank had picked it up. Kyle had gone back inside, slamming the door. Frank had stood in the yard for a minute looking at the ground. Frank had put the suitcase in the truck. Frank had sat in the driver's seat with his head against the steering wheel for a long time. Frank had gotten back out of the truck and gone back into the house. "He can't leave him," Megan whispered. "What?" "Frank. He can't just drive away from Kyle. It's the same reason he never divorced Karen. He can't finish anything. He can't ever close a door. He just leaves them open and hopes they'll swing shut on their own." Chris glanced at her. "When did you get so smart about him?" 7 years, Chris. 7 years of thinking about nothing else. They came off the interstate at exit 41 and took the county road east. Springfield was a smaller town than Columbus, older, with brick storefronts and a courthouse in the middle of a square and streets named after trees. Karen Bishop had lived on Sycamore, 3 blocks off Main. Doreen guided them turn by turn. They came around the last corner, and there was the house. It was a modest 2-story with white siding and a wide front porch, a maple in the yard, a fence that needed painting. There was a blue pickup in the driveway. There was a woman standing in the doorway of a small red hatchback parked across the street, phone against her ear, hair going grey at the temples. That was Doreen. And on the front porch of Karen Bishop's house, sitting on the steps with his elbows on his knees, smoking a cigarette and staring at nothing, was a tall, dark-haired young man in a black hoodie. That was Kyle. Chris pulled the truck over 3 houses down. "Stay here," he told Megan. "Chris, stay. I'm not going in hot. I'm going to talk to Kyle first. I don't want him to spook Frank inside the house. If Frank runs out the back through the yard, we'll lose him." "Then take Bruno." "I was going to." He got out of the truck. Bruno hopped down beside him. They walked up the street together. Kyle looked up when they got to the walkway. He was tall, dark-haired, 24, wearing a black hoodie and jeans and work boots. He had his father's eyes. "Who are you?" he said. "Chris Holden. I'm your father's stepson from Columbus. This is Bruno. Bruno used to be my sister Megan's dog." Kyle stared at him. "So he really did have another family," Kyle said. "Yeah, buddy, he really did." Kyle laughed. It was not a happy sound. He took a drag on his cigarette. "He was going to leave me here with nothing. You know that? Everything he told me for the last 6 months, he was going to walk out on. I just found out this morning. He walked in here at 11 with a suitcase, and I asked him what he was doing, and he said he'd made other arrangements." "Other arrangements?" Kyle laughed again. "For the last 6 months, I've been telling my girlfriend we were going to have money to start a business. I've been telling her we were going to buy a house. I've been telling her all kinds of stuff because he told me all kinds of stuff." Chris stood on the walkway and let Kyle talk. "He wasn't at my mom's funeral, you know that. He said he had to work. He drove down to Columbus that day. He must have been at your house." "He was." "For what?" "He carved a turkey. It was Thanksgiving weekend." Kyle put his face in his hands. "Kyle, look, I don't know what this is like for you. I don't want to know. My mom is a good woman, and she's been lied to by that man for 6 years, and my sister has been living out of a rented room for 7 years because she was the only one who saw it, and nobody believed her. I'm going to walk in there, and I'm going to put him in the back of my truck, and I'm going to drive him back to Columbus, and I'm going to make sure this doesn't disappear. Are you going to try to stop me?" Kyle looked at him for a long moment. Then he stood up. He was taller than Chris. He held out his hand. "I'll help you carry his stuff," he said. Chris took his hand. "There's a woman in the truck," Chris said. "My sister. Your half-sister, sort of. Do you want to meet her? Or is that too much right now?" "Not today," Kyle said. "But someday. Yeah, someday I think I'd like that." "Okay." Kyle nodded at Bruno. "This dog going to bite him?" "Only if he asks him to." "Good." Kyle sat back down on the porch. He lit another cigarette. He looked at his lap. "He's in Mom's bedroom," Kyle said. "He's going through her jewelry." Chris felt something ugly turn in his chest. He stepped over the threshold. Bruno went in with him. Frank was in the master bedroom. He was sitting on the edge of the bed with a wooden jewelry box in his lap. There were gold chains and rings and earrings spread out on the quilt beside him. He was looking at a small silver locket in his palm. When Bruno walked in the door and stopped in the middle of the floor, Frank looked up. His face did the thing, the stop and decide thing. Then for the first time Chris had ever seen, Frank's face lost the shape of the smile. He looked in that moment exactly as old as he was. "Chris," he said. "Frank, how did you—" "Meg had a friend in Springfield. She's been keeping watch on this house for years. You never noticed." Frank looked down at the locket. He turned it over in his palm. "This was Karen's," he said. "She wore it every day. It has a picture of Kyle inside from when he was a baby. She wore it to the hospital when she died. I took it off her neck before they wheeled her out." "Frank, I know how this sounds." "Frank, put the locket back. Get up. Come with me. My mother wants to talk to you before this gets any bigger. And it's going to get bigger, because you have $16,000 of my father's insurance money in your truck, and you have a lawyer in Columbus who's going to have some very hard questions to answer this week, and by tomorrow morning there is going to be an investigation. But my mother wants to sit across from you at the kitchen table one more time before that starts, because that's the kind of woman she is, and I'm going to give her that, so get up." Frank looked at Bruno. Bruno had not moved. His ears were forward, his tail was down, his weight was slightly on his front paws. He was watching Frank with an expression Chris had never seen him wear at anyone he wasn't officially working on. "I always thought he didn't like me," Frank said quietly. "He knew," Chris said. "He always knew." Frank set the locket down on the quilt. He put the other pieces of jewelry back into the wooden box, one at a time, carefully. He closed the box. He put it on the nightstand. He stood up. "Chris, Frank, for what it's worth, I did love her. I did love your mother." Chris did not answer. There was nothing about that sentence he wanted to touch. Frank walked past him into the hallway. Bruno turned and followed at his heel, not touching him, not needing to. Kyle stood up when they came out onto the porch. He and his father looked at each other for a moment. Neither said anything. Kyle stepped aside and let them pass. They walked down the walkway to the truck. Megan was in the passenger seat. She turned her head and watched them come. Her face did not change. Chris opened the back door. He gestured Frank inside. Frank paused with his hand on the frame. "Kyle," he said. Kyle did not answer from the porch. "Kyle, I'm sorry." Kyle looked at his father. He looked for a long moment. Then he took a drag on his cigarette and turned his face away. Frank got into the back of the truck. Bruno hopped up beside him and settled on the seat with his flank pressed against Frank's leg. Frank did not move away. Chris shut the door. Doreen crossed the street. She was small, in her 60s, with tired eyes and a firm mouth. She looked at Megan through the passenger window. Megan rolled the window down. "I want to meet him," Doreen said. "When this is done. Whenever." "Yes," Megan said. "Yes. Emma, too. She'd want to meet you. She knows about Karen. I told her about Karen, about who Karen was, about what she was to us." Doreen's face broke briefly, and then reset itself. "Drive carefully," she said. Chris got in behind the wheel. He looked in the rearview mirror. Bruno met his eyes. He pulled away from the curb. They put him in the back seat of Chris's truck. Bruno sat beside him, calm and heavy, and Frank sat with his hands folded in his lap and his eyes on the floor mats. Megan sat up front with Chris. She turned around once when they were merging onto the highway and looked at Frank. "Why?" she said. Frank looked up at her. "I got scared," he said. "Karen and I, we'd been drifting for years. And then I met your mother, and she was so bright, Meg. She was so alive after your dad. And I thought, if I could just have a little of that too on the side, I could be a better man for both of them. And then time went on, and I couldn't figure out how to unstick any of it. And I got scared. You stole from her. Yes. You were going to leave her with nothing. Yes. You told her I was crazy. Frank closed his eyes. That was the worst thing I ever did, he said. I have known it every single day for 7 years. Do you know what you took from me? He did not answer. Do you know what you took from her? Yes. You don't. You have no idea. She stood at that kitchen window every single evening for the first year, Frank. Chris told me. He told me she stood there at 6 every night because she thought I might drive up. She thought I might walk back through the door. And every night she went to bed and she thought tomorrow. And every morning she got up and she thought today. For 7 years. Frank was crying, silently, with his shoulders very still. Tears just moved down his face. I don't want your tears, Megan said. I want the money back. I want the paperwork undone. I want you to admit in writing, in front of a judge, everything you have done. I want my mother to have her house, my father's money, and her name back. Then you can cry all you want. She turned back around and faced the road. Nobody said anything for the next hour. Bruno lay against Frank's leg the whole way. He did not move. He was, as much as anything else, a warm weight there to remind Frank that he was not alone and not free, both at the same time. When they crossed the county line into Franklin County, Chris called Sergeant Nolan. "Nolan, it's Holden! Chris, where are you?" "About 20 minutes out, coming down from Springfield. I've got a man in the back of my personal vehicle, voluntary transport. He's not in cuffs, he's not being arrested. But I've got evidence in a folder on the seat next to me that says he committed bigamy in 1991 and has been transferring assets under fraudulent premises for the last 6 months from a household in your jurisdiction. I need you to meet me at 308 Oak Street in half an hour. My mother wants to speak with him first before we book him." There was a pause. "Chris, is your mother safe?" "She's safe. He didn't touch her. He never has. He took her whole life apart." Another pause. "I'll be there. Bring him in." "Thanks, Nolan." He hung up. Frank spoke in the back seat, for the first time since Megan had turned around. 16,000, he said, is in the glove compartment. Not 16,000. 16,200. I counted it in the bathroom this morning. I was going to leave 200 back, but I didn't have time. Megan opened the glove compartment. She counted it. She put it in a plastic bag she pulled from under the seat. She said nothing. "Chris," Frank said. "Don't, Frank. I want to say one thing before we get there." "Don't." Frank closed his mouth. They drove. When they pulled into the driveway on Oak Street, Linda was standing on the front porch. She had put on a nice blouse and had brushed her hair. She looked like a woman going to church or to court. She came down the steps as Chris opened the back door. Bruno hopped out first. Frank got out slowly, stiffly, and stood in the driveway looking at his wife of 6 years like a man looking at his own headstone. Linda walked up to him. She stood very close. She did not touch him. "Frank." "Lynn." "I need you to look at me." He looked at her. "Did you love me?" she asked. His mouth opened. Nothing came out at first. Then, quietly, "Yes." "Did you love Karen?" "Yes." "Do you understand what you did to my daughter?" "Yes." "Do you understand what you did to me?" Frank could not answer. "Do you understand," Linda said, and her voice for the first time wavered, "that I stood at that window every night for a year?" Frank's face crumpled. "I understand. You watched me do it. You knew why I was doing it. You knew where she'd gone every night, and you comforted me. You put your hand on my back. You brought me tea. Yes. You are a monster, Frank." He nodded. "I am not going to yell at you. I am not going to hit you. I am not going to swear at you, but I want you to know, before the police come, that I understand now, and that I know now, and that I will spend the rest of my life making sure that everything you tried to take from me and from my daughter is returned. Do you understand me? Yes. Then go inside. There is a chair for you at the kitchen table. Sit in it and wait for the sheriff. Do not speak until he arrives. That is the last thing I will ever ask you to do in this house. Frank went inside. Linda watched him go. Then she turned and looked at her son and her daughter and the dog on the porch. "Come here," she said. They came. She held them both against her, one under each arm, and Bruno pressed his warm side against her leg, and for the first time in 7 years, the four of them stood in one place, in one moment, on one small square of front porch, and they were, all of them, together. Sergeant Nolan came in a squad car 20 minutes later, with a deputy behind him. Chris had made all the calls he needed to make in that 20 minutes. The paralegal in Columbus had faxed over her report. Doreen had emailed her statement. Kyle had called from Springfield, unprompted, and had told the county sheriff there everything he knew about his father's plans, which had turned out to be more than any of them expected. Frank went with the deputies without a word. He did not look at Linda. He did not look at Megan. He looked briefly at Bruno, and then he ducked his head into the back of the squad car and was gone. The rest was slower. There was a lawyer to be hired. There was a bank to visit. There were papers to sign and file, papers to unsign and refile. There was a title to a house to be corrected. There was a will to be revised. There was a savings account to be restored, its balance reconstructed from statements. There was a hard, painful hour at a lawyer's office in downtown Columbus when Linda sat across from a stranger in a suit and told, in level detail, the story of the last 6 years of her marriage. By the end of the week, Frank Doyle had been charged with bigamy, wire fraud, and theft, over $10,000. By the end of the month, his lawyer in Columbus had been placed under review by the state bar. By the end of the year, Frank was serving 3 years at a low-security state facility outside Chillicothe. Kyle Doyle had filed his own civil suit against his father's estate for years of misrepresented promises and had, after some legal wrangling, been awarded a small settlement from the money Frank had transferred out of his mother's accounts. Linda got the house back. She got the truck. She got, more importantly, her daughter back. There was, later, a slow reconciliation with the neighbors on Oak Street, who had spent 7 years thinking Megan Holden had been a difficult young woman who had broken her mother's heart, and who now had to sit with the truth of it. Some of them came to the door to apologize. Some of them did not. Linda accepted the ones who came. She did not chase the ones who did not. There was later a first phone call between Megan and Kyle. It was short, it was awkward. It ended with the two of them agreeing cautiously to talk again in a month. They did, and then in a month after that. And then in 3 months, they met at a coffee shop in Springfield, and Emma came, and Kyle brought his girlfriend, and they sat around a small round table and did not, at any point in the conversation, use the word father. But they laughed twice. And when they left, Kyle bent down and shook Emma's hand very solemnly, and Emma looked up at him and said, "You have my mum's nose." Kyle had not been ready for that. He had walked to his car with his hand over his face. Emma started at the elementary school on Maple Avenue in September. She rode the bus every morning, wearing a purple butterfly clip that finally held her hair, and she came home every afternoon and told Bruno everything that had happened at school. And Bruno listened to every word. She started calling Chris Uncle Bear, because he had picked her up once at recess and swung her around and roared like one, and the name had stuck. Megan enrolled at the community college. She said she'd always wanted to finish her degree in veterinary tech, and now she had the time. She worked at the clinic on 14th 2 afternoons a week. It was a laundromat no more. having been bought back and renovated by a young husband and wife who had taken over the practice from the old vet's widow. Megan came home smelling like antiseptic and dog food, and Emma always ran to her at the door. Linda started sleeping through the night again. She started laughing again too. Not the careful laugh she'd used with Frank, but the loud, open laugh she'd had before John died. She spent a lot of Saturday afternoons on the back porch with Emma, teaching her to shell peas and to braid friendship bracelets. She spent Sunday evenings with Chris and Megan and Bruno around the kitchen table, playing hearts and gin rummy, and once, memorably, a game of Monopoly that had lasted until 2 in the morning. Chris worked his patrols. Bruno worked beside him. On off days, Chris took Bruno to the dog park or to the fair or to the lake, or sometimes just to Emma's school at pickup time, where the little kids swarmed the big Malinois like he was a rock star, and Bruno tolerated it with a saintly patience. He also once drove out to Chillicothe. He did not tell Linda he was going. He did not tell Megan. He told Bruno, though, because he told Bruno everything, and Bruno lay in the back seat and did not comment. He sat across a table from Frank Doyle in a small room with fluorescent lights. Frank had lost weight. His silver hair was longer than it had ever been, and there was grey stubble on his jaw. His eyes, when he looked up at Chris, were the eyes of a man who was living inside his own decisions. "I didn't come to yell at you," Chris said. "Then why did you come?" "I don't know." They sat for a while. "How's Lynn?" Frank asked. "Better." "Megan?" "Better." "The little one?" "Emma." "Emma? I never said her name to her, did I? I just called her sweetheart. I thought if I said her name, it would make her too real." Chris looked at him for a long moment. "That's how you did it, isn't it? You just didn't say the names. You didn't say Karen's name in our house. You didn't say Mom's name in Karen's house. You kept them all as sweetheart and honey and dear. And that way, none of it had to be quite real to you." Frank closed his eyes. "I don't know why I came," Chris said. "Maybe to tell you that we're all right. Maybe to tell you that the dog is all right. He remembers you, by the way. Bruno. He asked about you. Dogs don't ask." "You don't know Bruno?" Frank almost smiled. It was, for a second, the old Frank, the man who had carved the turkey. Then it was gone. "Don't come back," Frank said. "No," Chris said. "I wasn't going to." He got up. He left. He drove home with the windows down and Bruno's head hanging out into the wind. And by the time he got to the outskirts of Columbus, he knew that he had needed to do that he would not need to do it again, and that some door inside him, the door that had spent months creaking open every time he thought about the man who had been at his police academy graduation, had finally, quietly, latched. One evening in late October, about 4 months after everything had happened, Chris drove Emma out to the Cloverfield County Fair. It was the fall fair this time, pumpkins and hayrides, apple cider and caramel corn, and Emma was wearing a small orange sweater and holding a stuffed rabbit that had, thanks to Linda's careful stitching, finally regained the shape of its ears. Megan came with them. So did Linda. They walked the same midway path Chris had walked in the summer. They passed the funnel cake stand and the row of carnival games. They passed the kettle corn stand, which was still there, run by the same man in the same striped apron, who nodded at Bruno without seeming to remember him. They came to the bench under the cottonwood tree by the east gate. Bruno stopped in front of it. He turned in a slow, deliberate circle, then lay down with his chin on his paws. "He's tired," Emma said. "He's home," Megan said quietly. They sat, all 4 of them on the bench, Linda in the middle, Megan on one side, Chris on the other, Emma on Megan's lap. Bruno stretched across their feet like a warm rug. The fair kept moving around them. Kids ran past screaming. A man in a striped shirt called out the price of ring toss games. A country song played from a speaker somewhere. But on the bench, under a cottonwood tree that was old before any of them were born, 4 people were becoming still. Emma leaned back against her mother and looked up at the sky. "Can we come here every year?" she asked. "Every year, honey," Linda said. "Every year," Chris said. Bruno's tail thumped once against Chris's shoe. Emma reached down and put her small hand on the top of the dog's head. Bruno's eyes half closed. She scratched behind his ears the way her mother had taught her. "Uncle Bear," she said. "Yeah, sweetheart." How did Bruno know it was Mom? Chris thought about that for a long moment. He looked at his sister across the bench. Megan looked back at him. She was smiling, a small, real smile, and there were the beginnings of grey in the roots of her dark hair, and there was a scar above her left brow, and there was a 6-year-old girl on her lap who was made of every year she had been gone. "Some things you don't forget," he said. "Some things you carry, and you don't know you're carrying them until one day you smell them again, and everything you loved comes back." Emma thought about that. She scratched Bruno's ears some more. "That's a good story," she said finally. "Yeah," Chris said, "it is. And in a quiet, plain way, the way most true things happen. The story of the Holden family, a story that had been broken for 7 years by a man who thought he could live 2 lives at once, became the story of the Holden family that had, in the end, found its way back. To one bench, under one tree, on one October evening with a warm dog stretched across their feet and a small girl asking questions between them, and the whole rest of their lives to answer. If this story moved you, take a moment to hit that like button. Tell me down in the comments what part hit you the hardest, and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. There are more true-feeling stories coming, stories of loyalty, of second chances, of small acts that change everything, and I want you here for all of them.